All right. Welcome to today's Ethnic Media Services news briefing. I'm Sunita Sarabji, Ethnic Media Services Health Editor and your moderator today. Today, we focus on income inequality, which is rising in the US. American ethos dictates work hard and you will be richly rewarded. But most of us are working harder with longer hours and maybe more than one job, yet the American dream still seems elusive. Speakers this week will tackle the many factors behind income inequality in the US and offer policy solutions to narrow the gap. We are honored to present a really distinguished panel today. Dr. Michelle Holder, Associate Professor of Economics at John Jay College at the City University of New York. Dr. Michael Reich, Professor of Economics and Chair of the Center on Wage and Employment Dynamics at the Institute for Research on Labor and Employment at the University of California, Berkeley. Dr. Heidi Sherhold, President of the Economic Policy Institute, and Dr. Austin Clemens, Senior Fellow at the Washington Center for Equitable Growth. We ask speakers to speak slowly for our interpreters in Spanish, Mandarin, and Korean, and we ask reporters to enter questions in the chat. We will send a video of today's briefing and expanded bios with contact information for each speaker to all participants later on today. So we begin with Dr. Michelle Holder, who will discuss race and gender-based wage gaps. Welcome, Michelle.
Well, thank you so much, Sunita. I just want to make sure, can you hear me well? Because I have my headphones in. Terrific.
We can, yes.
Terrific. Well, thank you so much, Sunita, and for the Ethnic Media Services for inviting me to this important conversation. Happy to be here. So I will jump right in because I know that our time is very tight. And so let me start by saying that inequality in the US labor market can be evidenced in a few different ways. Labor market discrimination has been traditionally defined as, quote, pay for workers of the same, unequal pay for workers of the same ability. Unemployment rate differentials by demographic group, for example, there used to be a rule of thumb that the Black unemployment rate was typically twice the white unemployment rate. And finally, a third way where we can detect inequality in the American labor market is by occupational crowding, or what's also called occupational segregation, where some demographic groups are crowded or overrepresented.
Michelle, I'm so sorry. Could you slow it down just a little bit?
Oh, Apologies. Okay. No,
yes.
Thank you, Sunita. Okay. Right. So I'll just repeat. There are typically three different ways one can detect inequality in the American labor market. The first and primary is differential pay for workers of the same ability. The second way is by unemployment rate differentials by demographic group. For example, there used to be a rule of thumb that the Black unemployment rate in the US was typically twice that of the white unemployment rate. That is no longer necessarily the case, but that had been the case for a very long time. And the third way is by looking at the occupational makeup of the American labor force and seeing whether there are certain occupations where some groups are overrepresented in those occupations, which are typically low wage. The gender wage gap, or what the average woman earns working full-time compared to the average man working full-time, is typically a straightforward comparison of the average or median full-time wages of all working men, and the same for all working women. According to the Bureau of Labor Statistics, which is the statistical arm of the United States Department of Labor, as of 2023 annual data, men working full-time earned a median of $62,500 annually, and women $52,000 annually, which suggests that for every dollar men earn in this country, women on average or at the median earn 84 cents. A prime reason for the gender wage gap existing is because women are in fact crowded into lower wage occupations, more so than men in this country. For example, secretarial work, office and administrative work. Women are overrepresented in those occupations, men are not, and those occupations tend to pay lower. Another reason for the existence of the gender wage gap is discrimination. Lots and lots of research has shown that even when women have comparable skills, educational attainment, and experience as their male counterparts, they are still more vulnerable to earning less. Now, I'm going to move to what's also called the racial wage gap. And determining the racial wage gap is similar in approach as determining the gender wage gap. The racial wage gap is what the average Black worker earns in the US compared to the average white worker. And again, according to the Bureau of Labor Statistics, using 2023 annual data, white workers earning full-time earned a median of $59,000 a year, while Black workers earned a median of $48,000 a year. Or that would suggest that for every dollar white workers working full-time earn in this country, Black workers working full-time earn 81 cents. So as these numbers show, the wage gap between Black workers and white workers is actually larger than the wage gap between men and women. Now, if I look specifically at the difference in earnings between white men who earn the most on average in the country and Black women who are among the lowest paid in the country, along with other women of color. Also, according to the Bureau of Labor Statistics 2023 annual data, non-Hispanic white men working full-time earned a median of $63,700 per year, while Black women earned a median of $46,000 per year. So the wage gap for Black women compared to non-Hispanic white men, which I term the double gap, is for every dollar non-Hispanic white men working full-time earn, Black women earn 73 cents. So as you can see, while the wage gap that Black women face is not comparable to simply adding the gender wage gap and the racial wage gap, you can see that it is lower than both the gender wage gap and the racial wage gap. Now, other organizations have estimated the gender wage gap for other women of color groups. According to the UCLA's Latino and Policy and Politics Institute, Latinas working full-time in the US earn only 57 cents for every dollar non-Hispanic white men earn. And according to the National Partnership for Women and Families in Washington, D.C., Asian American, Native Hawaiian, and Pacific Islander women in the US earn about 80 cents on the dollar compared to non-Hispanic white men. But there is great variance in that number depending on the subgroup within the Asian American, Native Hawaiian, and Pacific Islander population. Now, the reason why I'm returning to Black workers earn on average less than white workers would include very similar reasons as to why women, including women of color, earn less than men. Black workers tend to be overrepresented in lower wage occupations compared to white workers, and discrimination does still persist in the American labor markets, such that even when Black workers have comparable skills, education, and work experience, employers still tend to pay them less than white workers. Now, what are some of the solutions? Of course, education is often advanced as a solution to better and/or more equitable earnings. And the data does suggest this. In the US, the more educational attainment you have, the higher your wages, your earnings tends to be. This is a pretty solid relationship. So where Black and Latinx workers are concerned, the fact that both of these groups have lower levels of college completion compared to non-Hispanic white workers does explain some of the wage gaps these groups experience compared to white workers, but it doesn't explain it all. Other solutions include actions that our local, state, and federal legislatures can undertake. Most of the effective current policies have been enacted at the state level, and most of these center around issues of either greater pay transparency or making illegal employer practices that have been shown to have discriminatory outcomes for women and people of color. For example, the legislation in New York, where I live, on posting salary ranges for job openings, or other legislation in other states that makes it illegal for prospective employers to request previous salary histories from job applicants, which has been shown to have disparate outcomes for women and people of color in the American workforce. If your locality or state doesn't have pay transparency laws, you should contact your local worker advocacy organizations to see what they're doing to push for such legislation. And finally, when women and people of color are in a position to negotiate their pay for a job, I recommend strongly that they do their due diligence in researching what appropriate pay should be for the job, reach out to their networks to ask about fair compensation for the job. And then I further suggest that they add an additional 5 to 10% on their salary or wage request, which is a modest ask, but I do recommend that women and people of color, when they are in a position to do so, try to practice that. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Holder. We have a few questions in the chat already. Let me take them in the order. We start out with Henrietta Burrows. Henrietta, welcome. Please ask your question and identify your news organization.
Thanks so much, Sunita. It's the East Palo Alto Center for Community Media, which publishes the East Palo Alto Today newspaper. Dr. Holder, you mentioned the gap between Black women and Asian American, Native Hawaiian, and Pacific Islander women. How do you explain that gap? And I'm wondering if Pacific Islander women are just being automatically classified in that category without there being a real breakdown as for their wages.
Yes, thank you for that question, Henrietta. So where Asian American, Pacific Islander, and Native Hawaiian women are concerned, I think your inclination is right that for example, Pacific Islander women, their earnings are not broken out in that group. So those group of women are pretty much lumped all together to determine what the gender wage gap is. And unfortunately, the Bureau of Labor Statistics does not break out that group for us to look at, which is why I had to research other sources for what the gender wage gap looks like for Asian American, Pacific Islander, and Native Hawaiian women. But as I mentioned in my remarks, there are some explanations for both why Black women and why Native American, Asian American, Pacific Islander, and Native Hawaiian women earn less than men. That would include explanations such as women may choose to pursue lower wage occupations because this allows them more flexibility with regard to caregiving responsibilities. And we do know that in this country and in most other countries, every other country in the world, women are the primary caregivers in their families. And so if they need to stop out of work or take breaks from work, that has a dampening effect on their salaries going forward. Employers don't tend to like to see that. So women may be choosing occupations which allows more flexibility. This is not an explanation I advance. It is an explanation that has been advanced. But the explanations that I advance would include that women are overrepresented in low-wage occupations in this country, so that if you're comparing men and women's earnings, that is going to reflect the fact that women are overrepresented in lower-paying jobs as compared to men. Also, discrimination does still persist in the American labor market. Audit research studies show this. And the research also shows that even when women try to negotiate as hard as men, that there may be backlash from employers. So there are just some things that are operating at certain functional levels that are contributing to the gender wage gap that women from different demographic groups are facing. But I'm happy to offline discuss this more with you.
Okay,
fantastic.
Thank you. I do have a follow-up. You indicated that Black women made even less than Asian, Pacific Islander, and Hawaiian women, and that was my question. Why?
Sure. So if you look at income data from the Census Bureau, what you're going to see is that actually among different demographic groups, Asians tend to have the highest income in this country. Their income exceeds that of white Americans. And so from my perspective, the fact that there's a gap between Black women and Asian American, Pacific Islander, and Native Hawaiian women is probably reflecting the fact that overall, the demographic group with the highest income, and probably my colleague Austin Clemens can speak to this, is the Asian community in the U.S. So it's probably reflecting some of that.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you, Henrietta. Orhan Akkurt has a question. Orhan, could you please identify your news organization and ask your question?
Hi, yeah, this is from the Zaman America. So when you talk about the salary, I was thinking about education and skills.
Yes.
So do you think that education and skills is really important to get better position and salary? Or why the corporations, or I mean, the employer needs to discriminate people with the same education level and skills?
Yeah, no, thank you for that, Orhan. Yes, I am a professor, so there's no way that I would say one should not pursue higher education, right, as a solution to ensuring that you not only are able to earn a livable wage, but also that you are paid equitably compared to other people from other groups. But the research does suggest that education will go but so far, so that, for example, if you have a man and a woman, both with the same educational attainment level, the same amount of work experience, the same skill sets, the woman is just more likely to be paid less than the man. That the data is very clear on that. But I don't think that should deter anyone from obviously completing high school, going to college, even getting a graduate degree. I just think that it should be a sort of thing that we recognize, that women and people of color in the American labor market recognize and try to navigate around, that these are the vulnerabilities that we are exposed to, that employers do tend to have preferences, those preferences play out in how the data falls out. So we just need to be aware of that. And this is why I had my solutions at the end of my presentation. But thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Holder. We're going to move on next to Michael Reich, Dr. Michael Reich of UC Berkeley, who's going to be discussing the gig economy and where that fits into the labor market and the underpayment of employees. Dr. Reich, welcome.
Thank you. It's great to participate in this. So I'm a labor economist at Berkeley. I've studied the effects of minimum wages extensively, including some of my studies have had a big influence on the economics profession and showing that minimum wages don't have the negative effects that are often attributed to them in terms of job loss. Now, and recently, I've been working more on low pay among gig workers. Indeed, I have done studies of how much drivers are paid, gig drivers in New York City and Seattle and Minnesota, that have become the basis for pay standards in each of those areas. And I'll come back to that at the end of my comments. So this is a quick primer. Not everybody knows how the gig economy is structured. First of all, although we talk about the gig economy often very generally, the number of workers who actually rely on gig income is pretty much dominated by the drivers for app companies. They're probably 90% or more of all the gig workers. And the companies I'm talking about are Uber, Lyft, Uber Eats, DoorDash, Grubhub. These are household names. So the gig workers are driving passengers or delivering meals. How many of them are there? Well, I'm going to count only the ones for whom the job is a main job, not a side hustle. Side hustle workers are much more numerous. About 6%, I think, of all workers are gig drivers for whom it's the main job. That means about 1.3 million drivers in California and maybe about 10 million nationwide. That's a lot of people. And also that number has been growing very rapidly, especially with the onset since the pandemic of delivery drivers who deliver meals to your home. So as I said, there are two kinds of gig workers, those who drive as a side hustle. I find that as someone driving less than 10 hours a week, say for Uber or Lyft. as compared to someone for whom this is their main job. It could be a part-time job or a full-time job. Over half of the gig drivers, maybe much more than half, are doing it as a side hustle, but they only do 10% of the driving because they're not driving many hours per week. Those who are committed, who are half-time, full-time, or more, they're doing 90% of the driving. So it's a industry where I would focus more on the ones for whom this is the main job. Who are they? We have some surveys that tell us that they're predominantly younger men. They're recent immigrants. They don't have an education beyond high school. Their family income is much lower than average, and they're more likely to be on food stamps and Medicaid than other workers. Now, what I'm going to be arguing is that drivers are paid very poorly. Why is that? Well, the first reason is the drivers are treated by the companies as independent contractors, not employees. So they're not protected by minimum wage laws. They don't get unemployment insurance. They don't get workers' compensation for injuries on the job, and they're not paid for meal and rest breaks. Moreover, the drivers provide the vehicles in which they transport passengers or meals, and many of them purchase that vehicle to do the work of driving for the companies, which means that they probably also have a lease, finance costs, as well as the purchase cost. They drive 10, 20, 30,000, 40,000 miles a year, which puts a lot of wear and tear on a car. And it means that the car is going to have to be replaced every few years. I'm going to come back in a moment to why that's important. So the other thing to understand is that the companies don't pay drivers for all the times that they have their apps on when they're available for a ride. The drivers usually spend about 30% of their shift time waiting for the next ride or meal delivery request. And that includes time waiting in an airport, or might include driving back from an outlying area back to an airport or a downtown. So that time the drivers will not be paid. The companies say, oh, well, that's because we're not employing you during that time. You're not working for us. You could be doing anything. But it's part of the business model that the drivers come back to where the rides are going to be, so they can be available for rides on short notice. That's the service they provide during the time they're not getting paid. I think that should count as work time. The companies also do not reimburse drivers for the wear and tear on their cars during the time they have a meal or a passenger in their car, or on any expenses between those trips. They basically view the drivers like the side hustle drivers. They happen to have a car already, and this is just an extra cost, a few miles, a little bit of fuel. But the actual cost, when you count the wear and tear and the need to replace your vehicle, when you put all that together, that's more like what the Internal Revenue Service says is the reimbursable rate for employees. Then you are eating up about half of the driver's gross revenue. So you're not paying them for 30% of their time, and the costs eat up quite a large portion of the revenue. So the result is that while companies are paying, say they're paying the drivers $30 an hour or more, that's using a very deceptive standard. They make up their own measure of how to count driver pay. In fact, in my studies, the drivers average much less than the local minimum wage. In states like California and Massachusetts, which are high wage states, they both have minimum wages now $15 or $16 statewide. The drivers get only about $11 or $12 an hour, and that's much less in the lower wage states. Why is the pay so low? How do the companies get away with this? Well, one reason is that many of the drivers, especially the immigrants, do lack the skills or connections to get better jobs. And so they're kind of a captive labor force. Companies also now use algorithms to determine which drivers will accept lowball pay offers for a ride. So it used to be the case that you wouldn't even know ahead of time how much you're going to get paid for a ride, and you were penalized for turning down too many rides. It's called deactivation. Now, as the business model has changed, and the companies use these algorithms, and they test what is individual driver going to accept? Are you going to accept a drive, just $4 for going to some remote place, for example? That pits the drivers against each other, and it leads to a race to the bottom for wages. It means that the companies have individualized pay and are giving more of their right offers to those who are most desperate, not what constitutes equal pay for equal work. Now, people are often ask me about the flexibility that drivers benefit from. That is, you can schedule your own work hours, you can turn the app on and off. Well, I would respond that can be achieved when the drivers are employees. Nothing in the law says you can't set your own hours. For example, UPS advertises jobs for part-time package delivery drivers and says they can work flexible hours. In California, the starting pay for these jobs now ranges from $16 to $21 per hour. So if UPS can do it and make money, so presumably could the gig companies. Now, another important feature or development in this industry is that companies have attempted to put items on the ballot in different states that supposedly guarantee more than the minimum wage pay. They did that in California. It was called Proposition 22. They're now doing it in Massachusetts. And these are very deceptive for the reasons I've already mentioned about how they measure pay. In my calculations, the guarantees amount to only about $6 or $7 an hour. Very, very low. Can lower driver pay be fixed? Solutions now. There are two policy approaches that have been attempted by different jurisdictions. One is to classify the drivers as employees, and the second is to keep them as independent contractors, but give them minimum pay rates per trip that would result in more like a livable wage. California had a law called AB 5, which tried the first approach to reclassify the drivers. That was defeated in what called Proposition 22, which companies spent over $200 million and gave many of the voters the impression they were voting to raise the driver pay, when in fact, if anything, driver pay went down after Prop 22. Massachusetts right now is also trying to reclassify the drivers as employees. There's a court case that's almost complete as we speak. And on the other hand, the companies are putting measures or possibly putting a measure on the ballot which is a kind of a identical twin of Prop 22 in California. The other approach, changing the pay rates, but not the contractor status, that's what New York City and Seattle did successfully do, and one in 2019 and Seattle in 2021. And the rates they set are scaled up to be equivalent to the local minimum wage, paying for all the time the drivers work and for all their expenses. In both cities, the higher pay per trip did benefit the drivers. It did not adversely affect the industry. And Minnesota is now about to follow their lead. So I'll stop there and take Q&A. Thank you.
Dr. Reich, there are a couple of questions in the chat. Let's start with Connor Atchison. Connor, could you please identify your news organization and ask your question?
Hello, my name is Connie Aitchison with Caribbean Today. Just a simple question. Are there any benefits to the drivers being unionized?
Good question.
Yeah, it's a very good question. Independent contractors do not have the right to unionize. It only applies to employees in the United States, but they can be designated as employees for the purpose of collective bargaining. In other words, the term employee can have multiple meanings, not just a 0 or 1 kind of category. And indeed, in Massachusetts, there is going to be a ballot initiative, most likely put up by some of the unions to give the drivers right to collective bargaining. So we will see what that will have, what that effect that will have. Presumably, it will give the drivers more power. Right now, they're really at the mercy of the employers. But I say this as in speculation. We don't have any examples of it happening yet.
Thank you.
It's very
Oh,
difficult.
sorry, please go on.
Yeah, it's very difficult to unionize the drivers because they're all working. There's no one common workplace. Now they're driving all over the place, and also you're only going to succeed if you leave out the drivers who are side hustle drivers, because they're not going to probably vote to have a union election that doesn't really matter to them very much. And there's so many of them, and so the initiative in the ballot initiative that's probably going to go on the ballot. The courts haven't yet approved all these, has certain categories to limit the drivers who would be eligible for such a union election.
Thank you. Araceli Martinez from La Piñon has the next question. Araceli, welcome.
Hello, Sunita. Thank you for the opportunity. I was wondering, talking to Nora Estrada, about if somebody have analyzed the gap salary among reporters working for EGNI media in comparison with those working for traditional media, corporate media, and because we have noticed that there is a national trend, even in Hispanic TV, to hire reporters as a freelancer, not as a full-time workers. Have you explored something, or somebody have explored something about this issue?
Yeah, I mean that's a major issue. There are freelancers in so many different parts of the U.S. economy, and they tend to be paid less. In California, there was a lot of discussion about this before AB 5 was passed, and some occupations were declared freelance but employees, and some were declared freelance but independent contractors. So they try to draw the line, and obviously the freelance employees are making more than they would otherwise, because they are required to be paid minimum wages and the benefits that I spoke about at the beginning. So yeah, very often freelancing is a way for the employer the company to save on money.
Absolutely. Dr. Reich, thank you so much. We move on to Heidi Scherholz, Dr. Heidi Scherholz of the Economic Policy Institute. Welcome.
Thank you so much for having me. This has been a wonderful conversation, and I will do my best to speak slowly. I'll have to keep reminding myself. Okay. Hardly a day goes by where we don't see like very breathless commentary about how artificial intelligence is going to kill job prospects and wage growth for huge swaths of the workforce. And I want to talk about that today. I will preface the rest of my comments by saying that I have devoted basically my entire career to analyzing and trying to figure out solutions to the problems in recent decades of anemic wage growth for most workers, rising inequality, and too high unemployment. So I've basically spent my whole career kind of worrying about what the labor market is delivering for working people. And one thing that barely even makes it onto my list of fundamental concerns about the future of the labor market is AI. So before I explain myself, I do want to be very clear that my on the labor market. So not on national security, not on democracy, nothing else, just on the labor market. But focusing there, technological change has, by and large, not been fully realized, but that squandering was not driven by technology. It was driven by changes in policies and institutions. And I'll talk about that more, but what that means is that the key worry I have about the impact of AI on the labor market is honestly how much attention concerns about AI are diverting from efforts to tackle the underlying causes of the problems that have plagued working people for most of the past 45 years. But then on the other hand, I do have a great hope about this conversation about AI, that the public conversation around AI's potential harms to jobs and wages could shine a light on employers' power and willingness to use available tools to degrade job quality. And if that then ushers in a new recognition of the importance of labor market policies and institutions that strengthen workers' leverage and bargaining power, then the AI conversation will have been incredibly useful. Okay, so the policy changes in recent decades that have disempowered workers and led to anemic wage growth and rising inequality are actually very easy to identify. It was policymakers, largely Republican, but with acquiescence from many, many Democrats. They weakened workers' rights to form unions. They allowed the real value of the minimum wage and other labor regulations to erode, made our systems of social protections like unemployment insurance stingier, and they tolerated excess unemployment. So basically what they did was undermine the key policy bulwarks that bolstered workers' leverage in the labor market. You should also say that my recounting of how these sort of mainstays to worker power were torn down by intentional policy choices, I didn't mean that as just a history lesson, because rebuilding them is the best policy prescription for dealing with AI's effects on the labor market. The policy portfolio of strong unions and labor standards, full employment, robust social insurance, that policy portfolio that was sort of once called social democracy, that was constructed precisely to ensure that the benefits of creative destruction unleashed by technological change in capitalist economies didn't just enrich the few, but instead boosted living standards across the board. So any policy agenda for addressing the impact of AI on the labor market, on jobs and wages, should have that portfolio at its core. And then I also want to say that if I'm totally wrong, and AI really does provide such a rapid, huge boost to economy-wide productivity that large swaths of the labor force are devalued, and I think that seems to be a core fear among people who are real doomers about AI's effect on labor markets. If that happens, the best response is again rooted in sort of the basic tenets of social democracy. Like in that scenario where AI takes all the jobs, by definition, owners of AI will see massive income growth. So the obvious policy hedge there is to add tax hikes on capital incomes to the policy portfolio that I already mentioned. So we will just be able to redistribute income gains made possible by AI more broadly across society. I do want to be very clear that I get that policymakers who are genuinely concerned about workers' welfare might find my recommendations too broad or too familiar somehow and want to instead talk about more tailored AI policies. And there are indeed some specific policies that could augment opportunities provided by AI or reduce risks in specific areas. So for example, AI holds great promise to help regulators and well-meaning firms detect and mitigate workplace discrimination, but it could also embed existing biases if it is used carelessly. So policymakers should require that all components of algorithms used in decisions like hiring and promotions be made available for examination and experimentation. That said, the labor market impacts of AI that can be addressed by specific policies fixes like that represent a tiny sliver of how AI will actually play out in millions of workplaces across the country. And that legislative whack-a-mole it would take to micromanage employers' use of AI would be absolutely impossible. And that's what brings us back around to the better answer being broad social democratic reforms. And I will just end by quickly saying that I think it's worth noting that in almost every case where people blame automated decision-making for introducing destructive workplace practices, if you scratch the surface, that destructive practice has actually been there for a very long time. So for example, many folks are worried that employers will use AI to monitor workers more intensively. Workers are already monitored intensively. And in a world with or without AI, unions, tight labor markets, and protective social insurance are actually the best ways to protect workers against the threats imposed by intrusive surveillance and like arbitrary dismissals that may result from that. Unions can negotiate disciplinary practices, so employers are not all powerful in deciding what constitutes like fireable shirking. Low unemployment means that employers will think twice before they arbitrarily fire workers when they know it will be hard to replace them. Like we saw that playing out in recent years. And then finally, robust unemployment insurance will help fired workers bridge the gap until their next job. So I will just end by saying, I think we all need to think of these broader social democratic reform as AI specific policies, because in my mind, that's exactly what they are. And I will end there, and I'm very happy to take any.
Yes, there are a few questions for you already, Dr. Shearholz. What people fear is automation, whether by AI or new tech, like the restaurant with robots or the rest home with robot healthcare workers. Could you address that? And then a follow-up question from me, is there data about a drop in traditional pink collar occupations such as secretaries and administrative assistants, which AI might be able to do quite well?
Wait, yeah, what was the first question?
The first question is, well, I think it's more of a comment, and if you could address this, people fear automation, whether by AI or new tech, will replace restaurant workers with robots, which we've already seen to some extent, and at rest homes, robots again serving as healthcare workers. Yes.
Okay. No, okay, sorry. Thank you. That's a really good question. So I'll just take that one first. It is true that when new technology actually can change the mix of jobs, like it will, we used to have, it would take however many people with shovels to dig a ditch. And now it takes like, half a day to dig a ditch. Now it takes like one person a half an hour using some sort of hydraulic giant machine or something. So it now takes fewer people to dig a ditch than it used to. And so in that way, that technological change does mean we need fewer ditch diggers than we used to. And we've seen that happen throughout history. It does not mean that the overall number of jobs will decline. It is there are no instances where you can look and say, yes, technological change actually decreased the overall number of jobs. And that is a little bit hard to square. And the way I think is useful to think about that is when an employer adopts productivity enhancing technological change, they do that because then they can create goods and services more cheaply. When they can create goods and services more cheaply, then people have money left over people who buy that thing now have money left over to spend on something else. And so they make new purchases on goods and services that they otherwise wouldn't have been able to make. And that generates other jobs. And so that's the dynamic that happens. So throughout all of time, technological change has led to churn in the labor market, but not a reduction in the overall number of jobs. And that is, small solace if it's your job. But the pace of change, it happens slowly enough that it has never tended to result in like large groups of workers getting pink slips. And then we do see these other good things that happen for working people as a whole. And then the other question is, I haven't seen anything about the drop in pink collar occupations with respect to AI in particular. That just nobody, anyone who's looking at this, is even those who think AI is going to have enormous effects, are saying we're not seeing anything really show up now. Like we're not seeing it yet. But we definitely, because of other kinds of technological changes, we used to have a lot of travel agents, and now people do their own booking online. The other kinds of technological changes that may be enhanced by AI have already happened, and they have hit some pink collar jobs like travel agents. So you are already, I think that there will be continued churn like that, but not a decline in the overall number of jobs.
Thank you very much, Dr. Sherholz. Henrietta Burrows has a question for you. Could you please answer it in the chat because we are running out of time? Thank you. Our last speaker today is Dr. Austin Clemens, who will speak on intergenerational mobility, which is a key driver of wealth, but has been declining over the past few decades. Welcome, Austin.
Thanks so much for having me, Sunita. It's a real pleasure to be here. So before I get started, I'll just briefly kind of tell you all what we mean by intergenerational mobility. So we often talk about absolute intergenerational mobility, and what that means is that children are able to out-earn their parents at some key age, like 30 or 35, say. Those are common ones in the economics literature. So it's this kind of like particular idea of what the American dream is, that children will have a better life economically than their parents did, will earn more money. We also sometimes talk about relative intergenerational mobility, which is a slightly different idea. That's about children being able to move to a higher point in the distribution than their parents. So you might think of that as like children being able to move into higher status occupations, that kind of thing. Now, a really foundational finding in economics from 2016 from economist Raj Chetty and his colleagues is that absolute intergenerational mobility in the US has fallen considerably. And so what they did is they looked at children born in various decades, and they found that if you look at children born in the 1940s and the 1950s, those children had about a 90% chance of earning more income than their parents. So virtually all those children were able to eventually eclipse their parents. But if you look at children born in the 1980s, that percentage has fallen to just 50%. So it's basically a coin flip. About half of children born in the 1980s would be able to exceed their parents' income when they are of adult age. Now, there's kind of two macro factors that we can think about as influencing this percentage of children who are able to earn an income higher than their parents. The first is just economic growth. So you can imagine, right, if the economy grows very quickly, if there's a lot of growth, that's going to produce a lot of new income in the economy. It's going to make it much easier to obtain high intergenerational mobility. The second factor is inequality. So even if the economy grows very quickly, if that growth is concentrated in, say, high wage professions, so we just see, lawyers making more money, doctors making more money, that kind of thing, then the high growth may not actually contribute to intergenerational mobility in the way you want it to, right? And that is, in fact, what we've seen in the US, especially in the 1980s and the 1990s. We see a very high level of wage inequality setting in, where most of the growth in income is happening at already high wage professions. And we see much weaker growth for people working sort of white collar jobs. Blue collar jobs, sorry. So those are kind of the two factors driving this. And what this paper I'm referring to did is they looked at which of those two things has maybe been more important in this drop in absolute mobility. And according to them, the inequality story is actually 2/3 of why we see that drop from 90% to 50%. So a little bit of it is that our growth has been a little slower than it was in the 40s and 50s, but a much larger portion of it is that the growth that we do get is very unequal now. Now, I want to talk a little bit about the story for immigrants. And so there's actually some very good recent research that looks at 2 centuries of immigrants coming to the US and what their intergenerational outcomes look like. And what these economists find is that, perhaps surprisingly, immigrants are actually more upwardly mobile than native-born citizens of the US. And that's been true across a very different mix of immigration over the years. And so, there used to be many more European immigrants to the US in the 1800s. Now we have a mix that's much more Central and South American and Asian. But regardless of the time period you look at, you see that if you hold income equal, that immigrant children have very good upward mobility prospects, exceeding that usually of native-born citizens. And when you think about the reasons for that, well, there's one kind of negative reason and one kind of positive reason. The kind of negative reason is that, when immigrants first migrate to the US, oftentimes they are underplaced relative to their skills. So first generation parents, because of discrimination, because they're in a new country, they might struggle to earn an income that's commensurate with their abilities and their talents. But then the sort of positive reason is that one of the reasons their children tend to fare quite well is because immigrants pick really good locations in the US to migrate to. Opportunity is extremely inequitably spread across the US. There are places where intergenerational mobility is very low and places where intergenerational mobility is quite high. Immigrants tend to pick the latter. They tend to pick places where there are good jobs, good prospects for education, so on and so forth. And so that has a very positive effect on second generation immigrants. Now, I should say this is a first and second generation story. And so, future generations will obviously face different kinds of challenges. But that's the story we've seen in recent research. Now, like I said, the US is very geographically inequitable with respect to access to opportunity. And so we do see a lot of variation among US-born citizens. And we see that both geographically, that there are certain areas of the country where people are much less upwardly mobile. But of course, we also see it racially. And, just to echo some of what Dr. Holder was saying, we see especially poor outcomes for, if you compare Black and white Americans are more upwardly mobile. It's especially difficult for, or there's especially low upward mobility for Black males, so male children, for a variety of reasons: discrimination, geographic location, the criminal justice system. These are all things that prevent those populations from having strong upward mobility. So turning to policy, I'll just, I think this has been mentioned a few times today. Heidi made it really strongly that, a strong labor market is one of the absolute best remedies to low mobility. And by a strong labor market, we mean one in which everybody is benefiting from sort of the gains of economic progress. When labor markets are very tight, as they are right now, that means that employers have to compete for workers, and that will tend to bid up wages across the low and high wage professions. So tight labor markets are incredibly powerful. And additionally, worker power in other forms. So, any legislation that makes it easier to unionize, that makes it easier to hold employers accountable, those are extremely important for giving us a more equitable distribution of wage growth. I would say, pertaining to kind of the policy mix that's in the air right now, one thing I think policymakers should be really careful about right now is that we don't want to sacrifice this excellent labor market to kind of the specter of inflation. And so, you know, we've certainly had high inflation over the past couple of years, but it looks like it's relatively in control now. And the job market, while it's been very strong, might be softening a little. And so I think this would be a great time for the Federal Reserve to consider cutting interest rates to shore up the job market a little and to keep it running hot. That's going to be a huge benefit to people at the low end of the wage distribution. Other policies we can look at, of course, reducing discrimination. Dr. Holder mentioned some, but you know, we have myriad kinds of discrimination against Black Americans in the U.S. Education, labor market, criminal justice, as I mentioned, are all areas that could help that population. And finally, I mentioned, you know, the importance of place. There's a lot of emphasis in economics right now at looking at how we can get people to move to better places where their children might be more upwardly mobile. But I'll note that people often have very good reasons for staying in the places where they are. They have family, they have assets, right? They have an emotional attachment to their hometown. And so another possibility, of course, is what we call place-based economics, where you might try to bolster specific places through, for example, the current administration's industrial policy ideas, right? Like the idea that we can bring manufacturing or construction jobs to a community that will be high quality jobs. I think we're still kind of waiting to see what the outcome of that is and if those can in fact produce really strong jobs. But that's another possible remedy to this sort of geographical heterogeneity of opportunity in the US. Thanks, I'd be happy to take questions.
Yeah, so a quick question for me. Could you discuss the impact of assets on intergenerational mobility? You cited Dr. Rod Chetty, who says that the top 1% get 86% of their wealth from assets. And I wonder how that plays out in for the rest of us.
Yeah, so I think this is an area of research where we really need more research, frankly, sort of looking at the intersection of how wealth and income impact each other. But there's been some recent research, actually, that Equitable Growth funded that looked at the distribution of looked at how wealth might impact children who are from families of the same income. And so what they found is that if you hold income constant, so you look at two kids who have parents who have roughly the same income, but one of those parents is in the bottom 30% of the wealth distribution, and one of them is in the top 30% of the wealth distribution, you see a significant gap in how upwardly mobile those two children are, which I believe is something like 15 percentiles of income. And so that kid who has wealthier parents, even though his parents have the same level of income as the other child, ends up being much more upwardly mobile. So certainly wealth seems to play an important role in mobility results.
Thank you. We're going to end today's discussion with a final question for all speakers, which is our founder asked this question, Sandy Close asked this question, is the American dream still attainable? Heidi, let's start with you.
That is a policy choice. Like when I think about the American dream, I think about a cohort of people being able to get ahead, being able to have the thing, like a house that they can afford, a vacation and the reasonable vacation in the summer, a safe secure retirement, like the set of being able to send their kids to a decent school. Like if we think of those things as being the things about the American dream, what people in general being able to have that's a policy choice. We absolutely have the money and the ability to make that happen, and it is up to policymakers to do the kinds of things that make that possible, to give workers the leverage, to make sure we have the safety net that people need to have the kind of security, increase social, like you can go on and on and on and on. It's a policy choice, whether we do that or not.
Dr. Reich?
Yeah, I would say, first of all, that in the last several years, wage inequality patterns have reversed. And with the tight labor market, but also because of the higher minimum wages, especially in California, New York, Massachusetts, we now see a whole lot of the wage inequality at the bottom that had been accumulating no longer there. It's the low wage workers who've been getting most of the increases. I think the same could be extended to gig workers if they were classified as employees by the federal government or by states, or if the kinds of policies I was talking about were put into place. So yes, very much I agree with Heidi. It's a policy choice.
Thank you. Dr. Clemens?
Yeah, I mean, if I can just kind of combine Heidi and Michael's answers, I think that, we shouldn't be blind to like good news recently. There's been a resurgence of union activity that's won some important gains, in various sectors. As Michael said, we've seen good wage growth at the bottom. The really robust stimulus that was implemented during the pandemic led to people building some wealth down at the bottom of the distribution. And so, I think these are all great policy developments. Now they're pushing back against a wave of 30 years of growing inequality in the labor market. And so obviously not everything has been fixed with just a few years of this kind of progress. But it's absolutely, the policies that we had in the wake of the pandemic are proof positive that we can change this if we want to. We can have a more equal distribution of wages. So, it's not like we've definitely lost something from the 40s and 50s when there was a much more equitable distribution of employment and wages, but we can get back there. It's a policy choice.
Well, thank you to all our speakers and reporters. Thank you for staying on till the end of our briefing today. We will see you all next Friday. Take care.